Hello and welcome from Buenos Aires, Argentina to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where Nate has conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those that have some connection to Latin America. My name is Josefina Dominguez and I am an editor for LATAM List, an English language source for startup, venture capital and tech news in Latin America. Crossing Borders is sponsored by OpenPay, a payment processor that facilitates transactions between online stores and banks from a website or mobile app. The greatest benefit is that you can receive payments from credit and debit cards, cash payments at convenience stores, bank transfers, and any other payment method you want. The platform, part of the BVA Financial Group, offers security and adaptability with one simple integration. Nate's guest today is Mariana Castillo, co-founder and co-CEO of Ben & Frank, a direct-to-consumer eyewear brand. They talk about why an internship at ALLVP played a key role in Mariana's decision to become an entrepreneur, the lessons she learned from working at Mexico's central bank at the beginning of her career, and they also discuss Mariana's insights on the direct-to-consumer category in LATAM. And lastly, Mariana shares her experience as a female founder in the region. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mariana Castillo.
Hey, Mariana, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
No, thanks so much for the invite. I heard you were looking for female founders for the podcast. So
yeah, we needed to feature more.
There's not that many of us, but there's a few of us doing the startup thing.
And you have so far very good stories. So I'm sure yours is going to be great to share as well.
I hope so.
Where are you in the world today?
So right now I'm sitting in Mexico City. After being in lockdown for almost 4 months, I'm still in my house. I've been doing home office for the past 4 months almost.
Tell me a little bit about your business. What are you working on?
So I am one of the founders at Ben & Frank, and Ben & Frank is a direct-to-consumer eyewear brand. We launched in 2015 with the idea that we could make the purchasing experience of glasses a lot better, both in terms of the consumer experience, but also in terms of the fashion experience, and then it not being just a medical device, but also a fashion accessory, and do it at an affordable price for the customer.
If someone's not buying from you in Mexico, what does the experience look like?
Yeah, so the traditional retailer is a very medical focused experience. So you walk in, all the glasses are under lock, and you kind of have to ask permission to try them on. The person that's helping you out is probably a technician with some optometry training, but doesn't really worry about how good you look. They're more worried about upselling because of their commissions. And it's as if you were buying shoes, and the only thing that people were worried, or the seller was worried about, is how the curve of your foot plant is on the shoes. So really, that's not the way anyone buys shoes. Sure, they have to be comfortable. Sure, they have to work for you, but you have 20 pairs of shoes because you want to have a different pair for the different kind of outfits, right? And so with glasses, it seems that all the focus was always about the optical side, and we worry a ton about the optical side, but it's not the only thing. So we try to give you fashion advice, and we try to give you honest advice, and you can try all of them on, and you can come in, go out. It really, we try to cater it to an experience just straight to the customer.
So we'll dig deeper into the business in a bit here, but I want to go into your background. Are you from Mexico City originally?
Yeah, I was born in Mexico City, lived here till I was 11 years old, moved to the US with my parents. We lived in a small town near Houston, Texas. We were there for about 4 years with my family, one of which I actually went to study French and lived in a French town about an hour and a half away from Paris. Came back to the US, did 9th grade in the US, and then we moved to Spain again. My dad kind of looking to try something new, lived in Spain for about 4 years, and then decided I wanted to do college back in Mexico. Came back to Mexico, studied economics, and I did a few things in between, did my MBA in Chicago, and then back in Mexico. So I always seem to come back to Mexico.
Did you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur and start something of your own, or is it something that came up during your business career?
Yeah, so never. The truth is my parents both had failing businesses. we had some economic hardship during a few years because of that. And for me, the comfort of having a salary was really important. And so I never thought I'd be an entrepreneur, to be honest. Life kind of led me there. And during the MBA, came up with the idea and just started trying it in a very low risk setting, which was the MBA, where you're not actually expected to make any money. And I would say that the support and the push from my husband, who's a lot more entrepreneur driven and has had success stories in his family, kind of pushed me to try it and not worry so much about the stability of a salary itself.
You spent some time at a VC firm before you started your business. How did that impact your decision to really go for it?
Yeah, so when I went to study my MBA, I had worked at the Central Bank of Mexico for a few years previously, and I learned a ton about financial markets, but it became monotonous and I was kind of bored of that. And so I decided to pursue my MBA, and I wanted to do a career switch, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I'd liked finance for a while, and I thought I was reasonably good with numbers. And so I started looking into doing some sort of private equity, focus more on the operation of businesses. And in my mind, this is 2014, private equity was everything. And then when I started to really understand that there's venture capital and then there's more of a growth equity or later stage equity, I started to realize that I wanted to get more involved in the early stage. So I decided to pursue an internship, and I worked with Federico and Fernando from ALLVP for about 3 months. And there I had the opportunity to do both things. I had the opportunity to work as a VC. I got to do the due diligence of a couple of companies that they were looking into and really understand the business models. But I also had the opportunity to work very directly with one of their startups. And we were rebranding, and it was a lot of fun to work so closely with the founders and just really pull ideas and execute quickly. And I just started to realize that that's sort of the career that I wanted to pursue, either through my own startup, which was not at that point what I thought, but close to startup founders where things move quickly, you're agile, and you have an impact, and you can create things that change lives. And so that's sort of, I'd say that my internship with them was key for me to decide to do entrepreneurship in any sort of way.
What lessons did you learn both at central banking and during your internship at ALLVP that you use today in your startup?
Yeah, so I think at the central bank, one of the things that I learned, and probably not in the good way, but how you set a culture for innovation and how you set up management practices that allow that. The Central Bank of Mexico is clearly not made for innovation, and I think you really have to understand that there are businesses that are made for innovation and some are made for execution. And I think in our case, it's a mix, because we're very focused on execution, but we have to leave some space to innovate and become better constantly, right? And I think during ALLVP, what I really learned was about being agile and flexible, and then also this big part of how important it is to prepare fundraise and how important it is to kind of knock on the right doors and be really prepared when you go out to fundraise. I think that's been a part of our journey that's been quite important.
When you were coming up with this idea, why did you pick this idea rather than any other idea that you could have done?
I think, to be honest, I wasn't looking to start. So I think a lot of founders look to start a company and then find what they want. In my case, it was the other way around, which was I found a problem and then I realized that I wanted to start a company to fix that problem, which was I bought a pair of glasses, which was significantly cheaper than the first pair I'd bought in a traditional retailer. The whole purchasing experience was better, and I just thought I can't be the only one that's going through this pain point so evidently, right? And that pair of glasses that I bought cost about a quarter of what I paid for my first pair of glasses, and so I kind of fell in love with that problem, trying to fix it, rather than falling in love with starting a company in itself. And at the beginning, I wasn't even thinking about doing this full time. I was just helping out Eduardo and Benny, who are my initial co-founders. One of them is actually my husband, and they were looking to start a company. And I told them, you should start this and I'll help you out. And that's sort of how we all came about to start the company.
And what was, when you first started the company, what was your inflection point going from just the idea to actually having a startup that was off the ground?
Yeah, so I think at the very beginning, and I think it happens to a lot of founders, when you try to visualize what kind of company you want to build, you're imagining the company you want in a few years. And when we looked at that company, we're like, okay, we want to have stores, okay, we want to have own designs. And then when we looked at the money we had in the bank and we looked at how costly it was going to be to execute, we started, and we were lucky because we had the resources of the University of Chicago, which is where we were doing our MBAs, and they were kind of pushing us to think more of a lean startup sort of way and think about a minimum viable product. And that's where sort of we said, okay, how can we do this in a way that we can learn a ton and it actually helps us launch, but that if it doesn't work, we don't lose millions of dollars that we don't actually have. And so what we were able to do was kind of the first MVP. We bought some samples, we branded those samples. And I mean, the first 300 pairs of glasses that we sold were actually samples from another, just like a wholesale manufacturer. And we created a website in a couple of weeks with Shopify. And we tried to do everything as lean as possible. And it was just the three of us, and we recruited someone at the very beginning, which was our fourth co-founder, which is Maria Jose, because she had all the fashion insight that we did not have. I mean, we're three geeks doing an MBA at the University of Chicago, and we realized that we were lacking a skill set to build a fashion brand. And that's when we brought our fourth co-founder and started really looking at what the business model was going to look like with her in the picture. And so it took us about 3 months to kind of get the company up and running. And then we started posting a couple of ads on Facebook and Google to see how much it would cost to get a lead to our website. And it was just a landing page at that time. And then by the time we launched with just the ads that we had put on Facebook and Google, it took about 2 days to sell first pair of glasses to someone that we didn't know. And it was kind of that first point of validation when you're like, okay, maybe someone will buy what we're trying to sell. I think we got a lot of pushback from people that we talked to saying like, look, Mexicans are never going to buy from an unknown brand. Glasses are an introductory product to the rest of the brand. So you're not going to have a Louis Vuitton bag, but you're going to have a pair of glasses or a Prada pair of glasses because it gives you status and validation. And I think that pushback was fair because it really helped us shape the company into a brand and not just a company that was selling glasses.
Talk a little bit about brand building in Latin America. It seems to me that from the startups we funded, it's fairly different from building a brand in the US. Do you have that same experience? And what's your view on how to best build a brand? Because you've built a very strong one.
I don't know what it's like to build a brand in the US, but I can tell you that I think one of the most important things in building a brand in Mexico is consistency. So when you think about the brand, you want everything that relates to the brand to reflect the same values and mission and vision that you have, right? So for us, brand is that ad that you see on Facebook. Brand is the product. Brand is the customer service. Brand is the unboxing experience. Brand is if we fail and give you a product that's not right, how do we fix it? And I think all of that makes up brand. And I think when you build a really consistent customer experience that really focuses on being a brand and being really careful about the language that you use. So one of the things that we've been very focused is creating this culture of like having pride of being a Four Eyes. When you were little, people would like bully you because you would wear glasses. And now we're saying, look, it's cool to be a Four Eyes. It gives you personality. Go out and share it proudly, right? And I think the important thing to building that is really creating this consistency of the brand and having it reflect across everything you do.
Direct-to-consumer brands have been a very big industry, and there's seems to be a pretty big opportunity in Latin America for them. Talk about how you see that category or that business model for the region.
Surprised that it hasn't actually grown even more. So I think there's a couple of, Mexico is probably the biggest country where we've seen this actually happen, but it's probably one of the only ones that we've seen this happen. So direct to consumer mattresses or direct to consumer furniture are a few of the direct to consumer brands that have grown significantly. But we've looked at other countries in Latin America and this isn't really happening as quickly. And I think that the opportunity is huge because the retailers in Mexico and the traditional retailers, number one, are moving super slow. And number two, do not have this customer centricity in mind. And I think as we grow and we see these millennials and Gen Z come up to purchasing power, they're a lot more conscious about value for money, and they're a lot more conscious about what the brand stands for. And I think that's where the opportunity is huge, where you have to compete with traditional retailers that are still selling to the maybe like baby boomers or Gen X, right? That have a different mindset.
Yeah, we've talked a lot to retailers, traditional retailers in the region about their kind of fears and things they need to change. And I think some of them are starting to maybe realize that they can't sell the same kind of commodity product with the same commodity experience for the medium term here. It's going to be difficult to compete with direct to consumer brands. And now that there's internet with delivery in places like Mexico where you can order on Amazon or order from other direct to consumer brands in the US, there's a lot more competition on those retailers. What's your experience been either working with or competing with the traditional retailers?
I think historically the barriers to entry in retail and in brands were super high because you needed a huge investment to make it. And getting into the top malls was extremely difficult because there's this key money. And so it was a very select club. And then the internet was definitely working, but until you had Facebook and Google kind of democratize advertising, it was still very hard to get people to go to your site, right? And I think the way to what we've seen is a lot of retailers kind of look at us direct to consumer brands and think, I need to move there. But also, and I'm going to say this pre-COVID, like their sales are still growing. Their e-commerce are stuck and it drains a lot of resources from them. So they didn't really see the advantage of pushing a digital strategy and a more like global look on the consumer. They were still thinking of the consumer as a multi-channel consumer. So the person that buys online is a different person that buys offline. And I think interacting with them, it's been difficult in some parts because they continue to want it to be kind of like a select club where you can't enter the shopping malls. We actually had like an anecdote where in one of the shopping malls we put a pop-up store in the middle of the mall it was a 3-month pop-up store. And we talked to them and we're like, look, we want to expand the contract for another 3 months to the mall owners. And they wouldn't let us because the traditional retailers were not happy with having us there. And so I think it's the first time that we really came and crossed paths with how powerful they can be and how much of a gatekeeper they can be. But I think what we were able to do was really create a brand that became a destination for a lot of people. And so we've kind of now see that where malls actually want us to be there and they don't mind fighting, because the difference is traditional retailers live off the foot traffic, while direct to consumers that do their digital strategy well actually bring new customers to the mall. And so that's been a huge power change that has allowed us to really like put down those barriers to entry.
You talked about how Mexico direct to consumer is growing pretty fast, but maybe not in the rest of South America or Central America. What do you think about the opportunity for Mexican direct to consumer brands to expand into other Latin American countries?
So, I mean, we've talked to a couple of these founders from the other direct to consumer companies, and to be honest, I don't think they have that mindset of going to Latin America yet. I think we're probably the only ones that are thinking this like quite quickly. And we actually opened Chile a couple of months ago, like 4 months ago of operation. And our view is Chile is our starting point so we can move up through the rest of Latin America and become a whole Spanish-speaking LATAM brand. And I think we can execute on a ton of what we learned in Mexico and just execute the direct-to-consumer playbook, right?
If you could go back to when you started the business, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
When I started the business,
Mm-hmm.
I think we would have moved quicker. I think we would have opened stores quicker. We would have leveraged more our tech quicker. And I think we probably should have moved internationally a bit quicker, to maybe a year before we actually did. And I think one of the things is we should have raised more money earlier.
Talk a little bit about the fundraising process. How was that for a direct-to-consumer brand in Mexico?
Yeah, so I'd say it's interesting and it's very different to the US because what has happened in the US is that direct-to-consumers grow really quickly get huge valuations, like really crazy multiples, and then their valuation is kind of stuck because what you are is a brand, and you're kind of a digital retailer in many senses, and having a 10x valuation really isn't justifiable by how you're going to catch up to sales, because you start growing it at a very normal pace rather than 10x very quickly, right? And so a lot of VCs are not looking happily at these models, because that's happened to a lot of them. And they're really good businesses because they create profit, they create a lot of things, but it's not as easy to exponentiate as a software company. I think in Mexico it's been a bit different. So I think for us, we've had very good interest in terms of local VCs, because there's not a lot of software companies that exponentiate quickly. And then on the other side, we have good margins, we can grow at a good pace. And so within a few years, we can be a very, very good investment for them. And I think that's been really helpful for us to raise. But when we've tried to raise in the US, we've had a lot of pushback saying, look, you're a lot of retail, I'm not sure I want to do this. And I think that's made our path a little bit more difficult, because fundraising in Mexico is a lot more of a price sensitive issue, which means you get more diluted more quickly. And I think if you don't get a signal from like YC or a big US fund, then FOMO isn't really as much in play as it is in other startups.
Yeah, the difference between the kind of startups that get the knighting by YC versus the ones that don't in LATAM is such a huge barrier. I can't even think of the right word, but it's a huge difference. I mean, it's a massive difference.
I remember a few years ago when Green raised their first, I think it was 25 million in their seed round or like a Series A round. And they had been operating for maybe 2 or 3 months. We had been operating for about 3 years. We were doing a good amount of revenue. We were almost profitable. And you see the huge difference in interest that you get from the different types of funds. That is just like, sometimes you just wonder, like, maybe I should have just gone to YC just to get that knighting or getting that validation that allows everyone to kind of have interest in what you're building, even if you're building a really cool business.
Yeah, there's certainly a huge, or has been at least up until recently, and probably will continue, a huge YC bump for LATAM companies. I mean, just looking at valuations of where they came out, we've invested in companies that are profitable, growing super fast, but haven't gotten that US exposure yet, at the same or lower valuations from people basically with
a PowerPoint.
the 3-month-old PowerPoint going through YC. So there's still huge opportunities for people to look not just at those YC companies, but also at the rest of the companies in the region.
I agree. And I think one of the really good things, though, is that as Latin America is getting more exposure, and I think it's happened in the past probably 18 months, you see a ton of great founders coming in, which is really going to create a better ecosystem all around. And I mean, valuations are going to soar. And I think the problem with that is if you don't get exits, then it's never going to prove that it can be a profitable investment. But I think like Mexico is a huge market for so many things that there has to become really big, really great companies. And I think that's going to attract more interest from the bigger funds as well.
Yeah, when you look at it macro, if you ask yourself the question, will LATAM have the same level of tech businesses and businesses going on the internet as you have in the US, Europe, and Southeast Asia? I think the answer is obviously yes. It may take a little bit longer than we would hope, but it's clear that that's going to happen. So it's makes sense to be investing in early stage companies in LATAM.
I agree. And I mean, this, you know this better than I do, but VC is a long-term investment. So if you can hang in there for about 5 to 7 to 10 years, then you're going to see the returns of that for sure.
What's been your experience being a female founder in LATAM?
I get this question a lot, and I think it has two sides. I think in the US, there was a lot of scandal for female founders because there's a very small portion of money that goes into female founded startups. And I think it's probably the same in Mexico, but my experience has actually been super positive. Like I've never felt that I was looked at different for being a woman. I think one of the things that helped me was that I had a background that kind of people assumed that I was ambitious and that I was really thinking big, because when you go get an MBA at a good school, your signaling is that of what a lot of times is for males. And I think that helped out. But I think I would say that the two biggest differences, or the two biggest things where I've seen a difference because I'm a woman, is suppliers tend to be a lot more machos because they're used to working with men. They're not used to having women being decision makers. And so I've had a couple of suppliers that have been like true assholes. And they were like asking to talk to my co-founders, and I was like, nope. And so I actually stopped working with them because they were like trying to make little of me, and I thought that was very uncomfortable. And I think the other thing is there's very few female founders that go out and raise money. And I think we could have a long hour chat if that is because funds don't give it to them, or if it's the type of businesses that women start building are not as ambitious here in Mexico. And I think we have arguments for both sides. But what happens is that there's so few of us that we kind of get showcased all the time, and we get invited to panels just to kind of fill the spot and say women are here. The problem with that is that a lot of times you get invited to a female only panel that ends up talking about what it's like being a female founder, and then you have all these panels talking about growth and really cool stuff, and it's all male because all the women are in the other panels. And so what ends up happening is kind of the same discrimination, where women talk about their feelings and men talk about really building great companies. And I think that's kind of frustrating for me.
That's something that multiple women on the podcast have talked about, saying that basically if they could change things in the events, it would be don't ever have a female only panel ever again, and just invite good entrepreneurs and put them on panels that talk about growth, that talk about building businesses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I hate the most is, how do you balance your life? It's like, when would you ask a guy that? Honestly, never. And so why do you ask me? Why don't you ask me about going into a new country? And so I think it's frustrating. I think a lot of times when you talk about like really creating better opportunities for women, there's intentions and then there's output. And I think there's really good intentions a lot of the time, but the output is not necessarily the best. And so when I get invited to one of these panels, I usually try to make a point of saying it. And I'm like, I'm thankful for having this space, but also know that it would be great if you gave me the space in the other panels and not just in a female founders panel.
Besides for the panels change, what would be some of your recommendations for either VCs in the region or just the ecosystem in general that you think might be useful?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's pretty lame is that there's not a lot of female investors. I mean, there's a couple that actually have some decision-making power. And so what ends up happening is the decisions to invest that you make are kind of biased because you don't understand half of I mean, you might be someone that understands women, but at the end of the day, there's a ton of opportunities that could only be focused at women that might get missed out because you don't believe it's a big market. And if you don't have women or diversity sitting at your table, that kind of pushes you to make decisions that are based on your biases and your knowledge and not a more diverse knowledge. So I think one thing that would really help is having more women be decision makers at different firms.
Is that something as a founder that you ask about when you're trying to raise money?
Yeah, so when we started raising money, it was 5 years ago or 4 years ago, and I think there were no women as decision makers. And then I just kind of got to know the other investors and kind of understood who wanted to be more inclusive, even if they didn't have women as partners. And that kind of did drive some of the decision to kind of who do you raise from. I think so. One of the things that like I don't like, for example, is my board is a 7-person board and it's only 2 women, and the 2 women is my co-founder and myself. I would love to have like another women with experience in my board, but that doesn't happen because there's not a lot of female people that can be in the board from the standards of the VC. And I think that's hurtful to the business in the long term.
Yeah, I think those are good points. It's going to be interesting to see. Hopefully LATAM can learn from the mistakes or challenges of the US and build a better ecosystem.
Definitely. I think as women that have raised money and as founders that kind of have grown businesses, we have a responsibility to kind of be that that different. So if I get invited to a board, I don't participate a lot just because I don't have the time, but I think it's important to help out other female founders through their different processes. So being maybe that mentoring role, but I think we have that responsibility and we kind of have to own it and be part of the change.
What's next for you in the business?
So for now we're focused on surviving COVID, but I think we're excited because I think we are in a great position to leverage our digital channels, to leverage the way we operate our stores, and really come out stronger from the crises, and push Ben & Frank to continue to grow at accelerated pace and continue in that Latin American expansion that we see happening in the coming years.
Well, I hope you're able to do it, and it's going to be fun to watch you continue to execute and build an awesome brand in the region. Thanks for taking the time to do the podcast.
Thanks for the invite, Nate.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with our guest, Mariana Castillo. And thank you to Ángel Andraca for producing this podcast. If you'd like to get a summary of the week's biggest headlines in Latin American tech news, sign up for our weekly updates on LATAMlist.com, a proud sponsor of the Crossing Borders podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend and give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the best way to share what's going on in Latin America's ecosystem.